Take a deep breath. Go on. What do you smell? Probably nothing. Before we dive into the fascinating world of medieval jobs, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment below. Your support helps us bring more stories from the past to life, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, let's get into it. I want you to imagine the smell of a medieval city. Not just a little bit of BO or some garbage on the curb. I'm talking about a physical presence, an entity, the combined, throat-catching stench of thousands of unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps tossed into the street, animal waste from the pigs and chickens that roamed free, and a whole city using pots and pits as toilets. It's a smell that would cling to your clothes and take up residence in your lungs. We love to imagine the Middle Ages through a fantasy filter, don't we? We see gleaming knights, towering castles, and epic adventures, but for most people, life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a gritty, odorous, and often brutally short reality. Survival wasn't about glory. It was about getting through the day. And to do that, you had to have a job. But we're not talking about blacksmiths and bakers today. Oh, no, we're peeling back the cobblestones to look at the stomach-turning reality underneath. We're talking about the jobs so disgusting, so dangerous, so bizarre, you won't believe anyone was ever paid to do them. So, hold your nose and steel your stomach. It's time to meet the unsung, unwashed, and unbelievably brave workers of the Middle Ages. Let's start at the bottom, literally. When the city finally fell dark and quiet, a special kind of worker began their shift. They had a few names: nightmen, gong scourers, but the most famous was gong farmer. And what was their crop? Human excrement. Before sewage systems, every castle, home, and tavern had a privy or a cesspit. It was just a big hole where all the human waste, or gong, collected. But those pits weren't bottomless. Eventually, they had to be emptied. By law, this could only happen at night, between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., to spare the public from the horrifying sight and the soul-destroying smell. A gong farmer's job was to climb down into that cesspit, sometimes waist deep or even shoulder deep, in years of filth, and shovel it all out. Imagine descending into a dark, airless pit with just a single lantern. The cesspits were designed to let liquid drain away, leaving a dense, solid mass of what they called night soil. The gong farmer and his team would dig it out, load it into buckets, and haul it up. From there, it was carted outside the city walls to be dumped or, in a surprisingly sustainable twist, sold to actual farmers as fertilizer. This wasn't just disgusting, it was deadly. The decomposing waste released toxic fumes like methane and ammonia, creating invisible pockets of poison gas. One wrong breath could knock a man unconscious, causing him to fall and drown in the very filth he was paid to remove. And this wasn't just a hypothetical. History records a man named Richard the Raker who, in 1325, fell into a cesspit and did just that. So why on earth would anyone do this? Simple, the money. Gong farmers were surprisingly well paid, earning more than many common laborers. One record shows a payment of 2 shillings per ton of waste removed, a respectable sum for the time. But the high pay came with a steep social price. Gong farmers were outcasts. People would literally hold their noses and cross the street to avoid them. They were often forced to live in specific areas outside of town, forever marked by the stench of their trade. They were the ultimate essential workers, doing a job vital for public health, yet they were treated like the lowest of the low. If you think working with human waste was bad, let me introduce you to the fuller. Their job was to take rough, greasy, newly woven wool and make it soft and wearable. Their secret ingredient, stale urine, that's right, wool, straight off the sheep, is full of natural oils, dirt, and all sorts of grime. To clean and soften it, you need an alkaline solution. The cheapest and most plentiful source of ammonia in the medieval world was aged human pea, also known as lint. The fuller's process was memorable. They'd take huge lengths of raw wool, toss them in a big vat, and cover them in gallons of stale urine. Then came the fun part. They would get into the vat and stomp on the cloth with their bare feet for hours and hours. The constant stomping, plus the chemical reaction from the ammonia, cleaned the wool and tightened the weave, making the fabric thick and soft. Just take a second to imagine that. You're knee-deep in a cold, sloshing vat of collected pee from half the town, stomping up and down all day long. Where did they even get that much urine? They collected it. Fullers would leave pots outside pubs and homes to be filled, basically running a city-wide pea collection service. The job was so critical to England's booming wool trade, the country's biggest export, that fullers were always in demand. But, you guessed it, their social standing was rock bottom. You were the person who always smelled faintly of pea. Still, without them, the knights and nobles of the age would have been wearing some seriously rough, greasy, and uncomfortable clothes. Every fine cloak and beautiful tapestry started its life being stomped on in a bath of stale urine. Let's leave the city stench for a moment and wade into the murky marshes. Here, we find another strange profession, the leech collector. Medieval medicine was built on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness was seen as an imbalance of these humours, and the go-to cure for almost everything, from a headache to the plague, was bloodletting, and the most convenient way to draw blood was with leeches. Barber surgeons and doctors needed a constant supply, which created a market for these little bloodsuckers. So how do you catch a leech? You can't exactly use a fishing rod. The most common method was horrifyingly simple: you became the bait. Leech collectors, often poor women, would wade into the still, swampy waters with their bare legs exposed. They would then just stand there, perfectly still, waiting for the leeches to latch onto their skin. Once a leech attaches, it can drink for about 20 minutes before it gets full and falls off. The collector had to endure this, feeling the creatures gorge themselves on their blood. When the leeches were full, they'd be plucked off and put in a jar, ready to be sold. The dangers here were huge. A good day of leech collecting could lead to serious blood loss, leaving the collector weak and anemic. The Y-shaped wounds left by the leeches could bleed for up to 10 hours and were incredibly prone to infection in the swampy water. And that's not even counting other risks lurking in the marshes, like snakes or other diseases. This was a hazardous, seasonal job, often done by the poorest of the poor, who risked their own health to provide the tools for the very questionable medicine of their time. If you thought the gong farmer and the fuller had the worst smelling jobs, allow me to introduce the tanner. Tanners were the craftsmen who turned raw, rotting animal hides into leather, one of the most essential materials. In the medieval world, it was used for everything: shoes, belts, armor, saddles, you name it. But the process to create it was one of the most foul-smelling operations imaginable. Because of the unbelievable stench, tanneries were legally required to be on the outskirts of town, usually downwind and near a river. The process started when the tanner got animal hides from a butcher, often with horns and hooves still attached. First, the hides had to be cleaned of blood and dung. Then, the hair and any leftover flesh had to go. To do this, tanners would soak the skins in a truly nasty alkaline solution. What was in it? Quicklime, water, and urine. Sometimes, they just let the skins putrefy to make the hair fall out easier. After the soak, they'd scrape off the rotted hair and fat with a dull knife. But wait, it gets worse. The next step was called baiting, designed to soften the hide. This involved pounding animal dung often from dogs or pigeons into the skin, sometimes by stomping on it with bare feet for hours. The enzymes in the feces helped break down the hide's fibers. Just picture that scene. Any cut on a tanner's body could lead to a deadly infection from the bacteria-rich slurry. Only after all, that was the hide ready for the actual tanning, where it was soaked in vats of water and tannin from tree bark. The whole process was exhausting, nauseating, and relentless. Tanners were seen as unclean and had a low social status, yet without their willingness to work in the gore and stench, medieval life would have been impossible. Alright, let's take a quick break from the grime. If you're finding this trip into the dark corners of history as fascinating as it is horrifying, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We've got plenty more unbelievable stories to dig up. Your support helps us keep uncovering the past, one disgusting job at a time. Now, brace yourselves, because we're heading to the royal court, where things get weird in a whole different way. You probably think that working in the king's courts would be a clean, glamorous job, and you'd mostly be right. But one of the most prestigious, influential, and sought-after positions in the entire royal household was, to put it bluntly, a crappy job. Meet the groom of the king's close stool. The close stool was the king's private, portable toilet, basically an ornate box, often covered in velvet, with a chamber pot inside. The groom's primary duty was to attend to the king during his most private moments. He was responsible for bringing the stool, helping the king with his complicated clothing, and then, well, being there, he would provide the water, bowl, and towels, and then whisk away the evidence. But here's the twist: this was not a lowly servant's job. The groom of the stool was almost always a high-ranking nobleman, or was the son of an aristocrat, chosen for his absolute loyalty. Why? Because this role granted something priceless, intimate, unguarded access to the most powerful person in the land. Think about it. The groom was with the king during his most vulnerable moments. He was often the first person the king saw, in the morning and the last at night. This proximity made him the king's ultimate confidant and private secretary. He managed the king's private finances, controlled who got to see the king in his private chambers, and had the king's ear away from the prying eyes of the court. If you wanted a favor from the king, you went to the groom of the stool first. During Henry VIII's reign, this position became incredibly powerful. His last groom, Sir Anthony Denny, became so influential that as the king lay dying, Denny controlled the dry stamp of the king's signature, giving him the power to sign official documents and effectively run the kingdom. So, while the job description might sound like the ultimate humiliation, in reality, it was a position of immense power and trust. It was the one crappy job every nobleman in England would have killed for. Staying in the royal court, we find another job born from a weird mix of status and punishment: the whipping boy. It sounds like a myth, but for a strange reason, it was a very real position, though some historians debate its prevalence. Imagine, you're a young prince, a future king, you're powerful, you're spoiled, and you've just messed up. Maybe you skipped your Latin lesson or were rude to an ambassador. You have to be punished, but there's a problem. You're the prince. Your body is considered sacred, appointed by God to one day rule. Your tutor can't just take a cane to the royal backside. It was seen as an insult to the divine right of kings. So, what's the solution? Punish someone else. The whipping boy was a young nobleman of a similar age, chosen to be the prince's companion, playmate, and classmate. They grew up together, forming a close, personal bond, and that bond was the whole point. Whenever the prince broke a rule, the whipping boy would be the one to get the physical punishment. He'd be caned or flogged right in front of the prince. The idea was that because the prince was so fond of his friend, watching him suffer for his own mistakes would instill a sense of guilt and shame. The psychological pain of seeing his friend beaten was supposed to be a better deterrent than any physical pain the prince could receive himself. It's a strange and ethically murky form of discipline for the boy who was chosen. It was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he lived in the palace, got a royal education, and was the best friend of the future king, a connection that could lead to immense favor later in life. On the other, His daily life included the constant threat of being beaten for something he didn't even do. It was a job that required a strong friendship and an even stronger tolerance for pain. Now we move from the bizarre to the truly macabre. In the rural, isolated communities of England and Wales, a figure shrouded in superstition and fear existed: the Sin Eater. This wasn't an official job, but a folk practice born from a terrifying belief about the afterlife. When someone died, it was believed their soul could be trapped on earth, weighed down by all the unconfessed sins they committed in life. To make sure the soul could pass peacefully to the next world, those sins had to be ritually cleansed. This is where the Sin Eater came in. When a person was on their deathbed, the family would send for the local Sin Eater, who was almost always a desperately poor and ostracized person. A ritual meal, usually a crust of bread and a bowl of ale, would be placed on the chest of the deceased. The Sin Eater would then approach the body, say a prayer, and eat the food and drink. It was believed that by eating the meal, the Sin Eater was literally ingesting the sins of the departed, taking them into their own body, and allowing the soul of the deceased to ascend to heaven. For this service, the family would pay a tiny fee, just a few pennies, to save a soul. But this came at a terrible cost to the Sin Eater. By consuming the sins of others, they were believed to become a walking vessel for all that accumulated evil. They were seen as perpetually unclean and damned. As a result, they were completely shunned. They lived in isolation, on the absolute fringes of society. Villagers would cross the street to avoid them, believing that even looking at a Sin Eater could bring bad luck. They were only welcome in a home at the moment of death, and as soon as their grim task was done, they were thrown out again. It was perhaps the loneliest existence imaginable. The Sin Eater was a living pariah, paid to damn themselves one meal at a time to provide a final, desperate comfort to grieving families. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, it created a crisis on an unimaginable scale, wiping out up to 60% of the population. In this apocalyptic landscape, a new, terrifyingly essential job appeared: the body collector. As the plague raged, traditional funerals became impossible. People were dying everywhere, in their homes, in the streets. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who saw the plague in Florence, wrote that you often only knew a family had died when the stench of their rotting bodies became overpowering. The streets were littered with corpses, a horrifying spectacle and an even greater health hazard. The grim duty of the body collectors, sometimes called baccamorti in Italy, was to clear the streets and homes of the dead. They would patrol the city, often at night, with a cart and a bell, their haunting cry of "Bring out your dead" echoing through the empty streets. Terrified families would lower the bodies of their loved ones from windows, sometimes with long hooks. This was arguably the most dangerous job in the world. The collectors were in constant, direct contact with plague victims. They handled bodies covered in the gruesome signs of the disease, the swollen, bursting buboes and the black spots that gave the plague its name. Many collectors were poor laborers or even criminals who took the job for the high pay offered by desperate city officials. As the death toll climbed, graveyards filled, and the collectors had to haul the bodies to massive, communal plague pits outside the city walls. Witnesses described bodies being layered in these pits like lasagna, with thin coverings of earth in between. These workers lived and breathed death. They were surrounded by the sights and smells of a world in collapse, performing a task that was both vital and almost certainly a death sentence. In a society where justice was often a public show, one person stood at the center of it all, both feared and required: the executioner. Their job was to carry out the state's final sentence, whether by hanging, beheading, burning at the stake, or the horrific punishment of being broken on the wheel. Contrary to the popular image of a hooded, anonymous figure, executioners were often well known in their communities. And yet, their profession put them in a strange paradox. They were a necessary symbol of the king's justice, but they were also considered impure, and were deeply shunned. The work itself required a strange mix of skill and a strong stomach. A good executioner needed a steady hand. A botched execution, like a poorly aimed axe swing, could turn a somber legal event into a gruesome horror show, enraging the crowd and shaming the executioner. Because of the stigma, few people chose this career. It was often a job passed down from father to son, creating executioner dynasties. Their association with death made them social outcasts. They were often forced to live on the edge of town, and many were barred from entering churches. They were the people whose touch was considered defiling. Since executions weren't an everyday thing, the pay wasn't always enough to live on. To make extra money, executioners often took on other undesirable jobs. They disposed of dead animal carcasses, cleaned latrines, and sometimes served as torturers. Some also developed a side trade as healers, since their work gave them a brutally detailed knowledge of human anatomy. The executioner lived a life of contradiction, a vital public servant who was treated like an untouchable, forever caught between civic duty and social damnation. As we venture deeper into the heart of the Middle Ages, we uncover even more curious, bizarre, and downright grotesque occupations. Jobs that were both necessary and horrifying, yet at the time, these unsung workers were the very backbone of society. Let's turn our focus now to those who worked in the midst of disease and decay, in jobs that only the most desperate would ever dare to take. The medieval era was rife with plagues, illnesses, and hygiene issues that we today would find unthinkable. In a world without antibiotics, vaccines, or even a solid understanding of basic hygiene, people had to rely on whatever methods they could to try and survive. It was a time when diseases like the bubonic plague could wipe out entire villages, and sanitation was a distant dream. In these harsh conditions, the job of a fecal remediator was essential, though absolutely appalling. It was the responsibility of these workers to clear out the cesspits after they had been emptied of their contents. Once the nightmen or gong farmers had done their work and removed the worst of the waste, these specialists were tasked with dealing with the liquid mess left behind in the pits. They would scrape it down into small channels and sewers, sometimes by hand, which was a particularly revolting job, given the stench and filth they had to work in. The job wasn't glamorous, but without it, the waste would build up, causing diseases and contamination of the water supply, further fueling the spread of disease. When we look at the horrific plagues that ravaged medieval society, it becomes clear that people did anything they could to survive. Many of these workers lived on the edge of society, away from the more glamorous, better-smelling lives of the nobility. But their work was necessary for the functioning of these towns and cities. Without them, the entire medieval system of life would have collapsed, succumbing to disease and unsanitary living conditions. Yet their existence was one of constant filth, disease, and social rejection. Yet not all medieval jobs were about dealing with waste. Some workers were tasked with labor that was just as physically demanding and dangerous, but in a completely different way. Enter the stone breakers. These workers spent their days smashing rocks to help build roads and buildings. The work was grueling, often done by hand with simple hammers, and the workers had to endure extreme physical strain. The noise alone was enough to drive a person mad, and the risk of injury was high, as rocks could break unpredictably, sometimes causing the workers to be struck or crushed. But these workers were necessary for the growth of medieval towns. Without their labor, no roads, no bridges, and no castles could have been built, and medieval society would have ground to a halt. But despite their importance, they were still considered little more than expendable labor. The same could be said for the sawyers, who worked tirelessly to cut down the massive trees needed to build the very infrastructure of medieval towns. Imagine standing 4 hours, straining against the weight of a huge saw, cutting through the thick trunks of ancient trees. The sawyers were the ones who made the timber needed for building houses, ships, and other essential structures. But again, despite the importance of their work, They were often seen as little more than working animals, their bodies breaking down from years of labor. Meanwhile, in the farmlands surrounding these towns, the agricultural workers toiled in fields of grain, barley, and other crops. These were some of the hardest working people of the medieval world, and yet they were barely above the stone breakers in terms of social status. The ploughman had a brutal life, spending long hours in the fields, ploughing, planting, and harvesting crops. The medieval ploughman's life was one of relentless labor under the hot sun, often working with oxen or horses to pull the ploughs. Their job was necessary for providing food to the growing population, but they were often trapped in a cycle of poverty, with little chance of escaping their station in life. And speaking of poverty, no discussion of medieval labor would be complete without mentioning the beggars. These unfortunate individuals were part of the fabric of medieval life, and it's hard to imagine the sheer number of beggars that roamed the streets of European cities. Many of these people were not able to work due to physical disabilities, old age, or other factors beyond their control. In an era where charity was often based on religious duty, beggars were common sights in medieval towns. They would gather at church doorways, holding out their hands for alms. These individuals were often seen as a reminder of the fragility of life. Yet many were treated as little more than nuisances, pushed to the outskirts of society and forced to beg for their survival. Despite the growing wealth of cities, the beggars remained as invisible as the filth on the streets, often left to starve or die from disease. The life of a beggar was no better than that of a laborer, and in some ways, it was far worse. They lived at the mercy of the goodwill of others. But the lack of social support systems meant that if they didn't have a family or connections to help them, they were left to fend for themselves in the harsh, unforgiving medieval world. Now, moving back into the towns, we can explore the more specialized, albeit equally grim, professions that kept the gears of medieval society moving. One of these was the chimney sweep. Though it may sound less horrifying than some of the jobs we've discussed so far, the reality of being a chimney sweep in medieval times was far from glamorous. These workers were tasked with climbing into the narrow, soot-filled chimneys of medieval homes, scrubbing out the thick black residue left behind by years of burning wood and coal. The soot, which was often caked so thick that it required intense scraping, would frequently block the chimney and create hazardous fires. The job was grueling and dangerous, as chimney sweeps would sometimes have to work their way up high, precarious chimneys, often with little protection. The risk of falling was ever present. In addition to this, working in these confined spaces meant breathing in thick, unhealthy soot, which caused respiratory issues and other health problems. The job wasn't just physically demanding, but also emotionally taxing, as chimney sweeps were often children, forced into the profession due to their small size, which allowed them to navigate the narrow spaces in the chimneys. These children were often orphaned, abandoned, or born into poverty, left with no other choice but to climb into the soot-filled chimneys that loomed over the homes of the rich. These young sweeps were subjected to grueling hours of work, often from dawn until dusk, their hands and faces covered in soot. While many were desperate to escape this life, few ever found the opportunity to do so. Despite this, the work was considered essential for keeping the fires burning in the medieval homes, and without chimney sweeps, the towns would have been plagued by dangerous fires. In the world of medieval entertainment, however, the jobs were no less grueling or disturbing. Enter the bear baiters. This profession involved forcing a bear into a pit, often chained, where it would be taunted and attacked by dogs as part of a public spectacle. While bear baiting was popular in medieval times, it was a cruel and violent display that required workers to care for and manage the bears. Bear baiters were tasked with overseeing the animals, ensuring they were properly restrained and controlled. During these brutal displays, the job often involved extreme risk, as bears are naturally fierce creatures, and any sign of aggression could lead to serious injury or death. But the most disturbing aspect of this job was the sheer violence and cruelty involved. The bears were typically starved, weakened, or wounded before the events to ensure they would fight in the pit. This horrific entertainment was enjoyed by the masses, but it came at a cost for the animals, as well as for those who worked in the bloody business. As we've seen, medieval jobs often involve suffering, sacrifice, and danger. From the laborers working in fields, to the artisans creating masterpieces under difficult conditions, to the beggars struggling to survive, every facet of medieval life was shaped by those who toiled in the shadows. Their jobs were necessary, but they were often disgusting, dangerous, and degrading. The reality of the Middle Ages was not one of grand castles or heroic knights, but of raw, gritty survival. In this harsh world, it was the unsung workers, toiling in the filth and grime of everyday life, who kept the medieval world moving. Whether they were clearing out cesspits, scraping soot from chimneys, or enduring the horrors of bear baiting, these workers faced unimaginable challenges with little recognition or reward. And yet, despite the griminess of their jobs, these individuals helped build the foundations of the society we know today. From the sanitation systems that kept cities from succumbing to disease, to the craftsmanship that created the castles and cathedrals that still stand today, these workers were the silent heroes of the medieval world. While they may have been forgotten by history, their contributions were essential to the survival and growth of medieval civilization. As we continue to look back at these jobs, it's important to remember the lives of those who lived in this grim reality. Their stories are not just about hardship, but about resilience, survival, and the grit it took to make it through the darkest periods of human history. And though their jobs were often repugnant and dangerous, without them, the Middle Ages would have been a far less habitable place for everyone. The truth is, the Middle Ages may not have been a time of glory and grandeur for the masses, but for those who endured these repulsive, exhausting jobs, it was a time of resilience, grit, and survival against all odds. These workers may have been the unsung heroes of their time, but without their sacrifices, the Middle Ages would have never thrived. As we continue to delve deeper into the world of medieval labor, we must acknowledge that the society of the time was built on a foundation of class divisions, where wealth, privilege, and status were often reserved for the few, while the majority worked in the most grueling and dehumanizing conditions imaginable. In this society, the plight of the workers was a backdrop to the stories of kings, queens, and knights in shining armor. Yet, the true fabric of medieval life was woven by the people whose names and stories we'll never know. Their labor essential yet invisible. One of the most vital and yet underappreciated roles during the medieval period was that of the dung dealer. While the name itself might evoke a bit of humor, these workers were crucial for the survival of urban centers in an era before modern plumbing and waste disposal systems. With no sewer systems to flush away waste, cities became a patchwork of privies, cesspits, and public latrines. But someone had to remove the excrement that accumulated in these spaces, and that someone was the dung dealer. These workers, often referred to as dungmen, had one of the most unpleasant jobs imaginable. They worked day and night hauling away the waste from households, taverns, and public latrines. Dungmen typically carried large baskets or carts filled with waste to be dumped on the outskirts of town or, in many cases, transported to farms where it would be used as fertilizer. While the task itself was grim, it was not without value. Human waste, when properly composted, could enrich soil, leading to better crop yields. But it wasn't just human waste that these workers had to deal with. Animal waste, particularly from horses, was a significant concern in crowded cities where livestock was common. The piles of manure left in the streets by carts and horses could cause significant sanitation problems. From the spread of disease to unpleasant odors, dung dealers would remove these piles, often working in the early morning hours, so that the streets could be kept clear and more hospitable to the people who lived and worked there. Despite the value of their labor, dung dealers were often ostracized, their work viewed as dirty and degrading. They were essential to urban life, but they were rarely afforded respect. And then there were the leather workers, another group of skilled artisans whose labor was often difficult and unpleasant, yet incredibly important. Leather was used in nearly every aspect of medieval life, from armor to shoes, belts, and saddles. The process of making leather was complex and involved numerous steps, many of which were incredibly hazardous to the workers. For example, leather workers often worked with toxic chemicals, such as lime and tannins, to preserve and soften the hides. The stench of the tannery was overpowering, a mixture of rotting flesh, feces, and harsh chemicals. Yet, despite the unpleasant conditions, the leather workers were vital to medieval society, producing goods that were integral to the functioning of the economy. Their work required skill, precision, and an almost superhuman ability to endure the stench and labor. The art of candle making also played a significant role in medieval society. Before the advent of electric light, candles were one of the primary sources of illumination in homes, churches, and public spaces. Candle makers, or chandlers, worked long hours in dimly lit workshops, crafting candles from tallow, beeswax, or sometimes a mixture of both. The job was physically demanding, requiring a great deal of attention to detail to ensure the candles were uniform and free from defects. In the process, chandlers were exposed to the toxic fumes of the burning tallow and the beeswax, which could lead to respiratory problems over time. Their work was essential to medieval life, as candles provided light during the long, dark winters and were used in religious ceremonies and everyday activities alike. Despite their importance, candle makers were often considered low-status workers, marginalized by their association with the production of an everyday commodity. Then, we come to the water carriers, another group of individuals who were absolutely critical to the functioning of medieval society. In a time before indoor plumbing, water was often carried in large vessels from wells, rivers, or communal water sources to the homes of the wealthy, as well as to public places like churches and market squares. Water carriers worked in extreme conditions, hauling heavy buckets of water up from wells or fetching water from rivers that could be miles away from the city. The task itself was grueling and physically demanding, but the risk was also high, as water carriers often had to navigate muddy streets, slippery cobblestones, and even busy marketplaces. Women, children, and men alike could be found carrying water in these urban centers, and while the work was important, water carriers often found themselves subject to abuse, as their work was seen as lowly and beneath others. Even in the most revered spaces of medieval life, there were unsung workers who endured dangerous and degrading tasks. Take, for example, the scriveners who transcribed manuscripts by hand. In an era where books were scarce and valuable, the scriveners played a crucial role in copying religious texts, legal documents, and scholarly works. However, their work came with its own set of challenges. Scriveners worked long hours in scriptoriums, dimly lit rooms filled with the constant flicking of quills and the sound of ink being applied to parchment. The act of copying could be tedious, and even worse, the ink used in the process was often toxic, and the fumes could lead to headaches, nausea, and other health problems. Scriveners were also at the mercy of their patrons, often treated as little more than servants who were paid a pittance for their time and effort. Yet, without their labor, much of the knowledge of the ancient world would have been lost. Despite these incredibly difficult and often dangerous tasks, medieval workers did not have the same recognition or respect that we would expect today. The medieval class system was rigid, and for most people, social mobility was a distant dream. The children of peasants were likely to grow up to be peasants themselves, as they would inherit the same trades, occupations, and land that their parents had before them. The ruling elite, on the other hand, often had little understanding or appreciation for the labor of the lower classes, who made their luxurious lifestyles possible. Yet, The reality was that these workers were essential to the functioning of medieval society. The architecture, the roads, the cloth, the tools, and even the very food that kept the population alive all depended on the labor of these often anonymous workers. The middle and upper classes enjoyed their comforts because of the labor of those below them, who toiled in the filth and danger of the medieval world. Interestingly, some workers were in jobs that we might consider to be entrepreneurial in nature, or at least positions that allowed them to rise above their station in life. Take the barbers, for example. In addition to providing haircuts, barbers in the medieval period also served as surgeons, a role that was considered to be beneath physicians, but essential nonetheless. Barbers were often responsible for performing bloodlettings, tooth extractions, and other medical procedures. While they may not have had the medical training or status of a doctor, they were trusted to handle the practical aspects of healthcare. In a society where the wealthiest individuals often had the most access to doctors and physicians, the barbers provided affordable care to the rest of the population. While the work was vital, it was also dangerous. Barbers faced a constant risk of spreading infections through unsanitary tools and practices. Still, their work was indispensable, as people had little access to modern healthcare and relied on these individuals for their medical needs. In a similar vein, the apothecaries were another group of workers whose labor directly impacted the health of society. Apothecaries served as the medieval equivalent of pharmacists, preparing medicinal potions, salves, and remedies. They were often highly skilled in the use of herbs, roots, and other natural substances, and they played a critical role in treating the common ailments of the day. But like barbers, apothecaries were often marginalized, treated with suspicion by the higher classes who preferred the advice of learned doctors. However, the apothecaries' skill in healing and their knowledge of herbs and remedies meant that they were often called upon in times of sickness and plague, when the need for their expertise was greatest. The more we look at these medieval jobs, the more it becomes clear that medieval society was a complex web of dependence. The wealthy relied on the labor of the poor, but in turn, the poor relied on the rich for patronage and protection. The workers who filled the ditches, dug the tunnels, made the shoes, crafted the armor, and built the castles were all essential to the functioning of the medieval world. Yet, their lives were often marked by hardship, disease, and short life expectancies. Their work was physically exhausting, and yet, despite its essential nature, they were relegated to the margins of society. While history has often romanticized the Middle Ages through the lens of knights in shining armor and kings on thrones, the real story of the era is much darker and more complex. The workers who lived in the shadows of the great cathedrals and castles played a pivotal role in shaping the medieval world. Their sacrifices, while largely unacknowledged in their time, laid the foundation for the advances that would come later. The world of medieval labor, filled with grit and unrelenting hardship, was built on a foundation of necessity and resilience. Yet, as we explore further into the jobs of those who lived in the margins of society, it becomes clear that some occupations were fraught with even greater danger. These workers, living in the shadow of societal structures that were designed to keep them in their place, had jobs that involved more than just physical endurance. They had to navigate the threat of death and the looming specter of illness, all while remaining in the service of the higher classes. Consider the gravediggers, for instance. While their work may sound morbid, it was essential for maintaining the public health of the community. In an age before modern embalming techniques, the bodies of the dead would quickly decompose. As epidemics swept through towns and villages, the graveyards filled at an alarming rate. In places like London during the Black Death, entire graveyards would be overwhelmed, forcing gravediggers to work under horrific conditions. Gravediggers would spend long hours, often in the dead of night, digging mass graves to accommodate the rising death toll. The work was exhausting, and as the bodies piled up, the gravediggers themselves were at risk. They were directly exposed to the diseases that caused the mass deaths: plague, smallpox, and countless other infectious diseases, and often, the gravediggers were the first to fall ill. Some gravediggers would wear rudimentary protection, like cloth masks soaked in vinegar or herbs, but this was little more than a stopgap measure against the real dangers. As they worked, they often risked being struck down by the very diseases they were trying to bury. Gravediggers were also tasked with the horrific job of preparing the bodies for burial, a process that could involve cleaning and dressing the corpse. For most people in medieval society, death was a deeply spiritual and ritualistic event, yet, for the gravedigger, death was a routine part of their job, and the emotional toll of repeatedly digging graves for the dead, many of whom had died in brutal and unceremonious ways, was a heavy burden. In addition, gravediggers were often relegated to the outskirts of town, their work not only devalued, but also feared. The constant association with death marked them as outsiders in a society that, ironically, also depended on their work to maintain order in the afterlife. Even more startling was the role of the plague doctors, who were similarly caught between science and superstition. During the worst outbreaks of the plague, physicians had little understanding of how the disease spread. With no antibiotics or modern medical tools at their disposal, they resorted to crude and often ineffective methods of treatment. The most famous of these practitioners, the plague doctor, wore a bizarre costume, including a long-beaked mask, which was stuffed with aromatic herbs, flowers, and spices. The mask was believed to protect the wearer from the bad air or miasma thought to cause the disease. In truth, these doctors were not always trained physicians. Instead, many were unqualified individuals who took up the job simply because it paid well, and there was a desperate need for someone, anyone, to tend to the sick and dying. Their work often involved administering ineffective remedies such as bloodletting, which not only failed to cure but sometimes hastened the patient's death. The plague doctors themselves were at great risk of infection, and many succumbed to the disease they were meant to fight. The job was not only physically exhausting but psychologically taxing, as they had to watch countless people die without being able to offer any real help. Meanwhile, another group of workers, the rat catchers, found themselves dealing with the creatures responsible for spreading the plague. As rats swarmed cities, they brought fleas infected with the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis, the cause of the plague. In many cities, rat catchers were employed to try and control the rat population, a task that was no easy feat. These workers would often be seen carrying large sacks or traps, trying to capture or kill as many rats as possible. While the profession itself was vital for disease control, it was also seen as a thankless job performed by the lower classes, who were often looked down upon for their association with vermin. But beyond the physical dangers and diseases, there were also social and psychological risks for workers in these roles. The tanners, for example, lived with a constant stigma attached to their profession. The tanneries, already infamous for their foul smells and unhealthy working conditions, were often places where workers were forced to live in isolation. The odor of rotting animal hides, combined with the toxic chemicals used in the tanning process, was enough to keep people away. Tanners were feared and considered unclean by society, relegated to the outskirts of towns and villages where the stench wouldn't affect the rest of the population. Their work was essential, yet their social standing was virtually non-existent. In some cases, entire communities existed on the periphery of these labor systems, small, isolated groups of people who were born into these professions and could rarely, if ever, escape their fates. These workers were often shunned, regarded as untouchables by those who had the privilege of living outside the chaos and filth of the lower classes. They were treated with disdain, even as they provided essential services. The medieval world was a place of strict social hierarchies, and those who occupied the lowest rungs of society often found themselves caught in a cycle of poverty, hard labor, and societal rejection. But not all roles were defined by a sense of isolation or degradation. Some individuals who lived in the margins of society were able to carve out lives that provided them with some degree of agency. Take, for example, the performers who traveled between towns and cities, entertaining the masses with their songs, plays, and tricks. These performers, whether minstrels, jesters, or street magicians, were often considered lower in status, but their work brought joy and laughter to communities that had little in the way of entertainment. However, the life of a performer was not always glamorous. Minstrels, for example, often lived on the move, constantly shifting between towns to find work. They were dependent on the generosity of their audience for sustenance and could be easily rejected or scorned if the crowd didn't enjoy their performance. Though these performers lived precariously, their role in society was unique. They had a certain mobility and, in some cases, even influence, since they could reach people across the social spectrum. A clever jester in a royal court might have more influence over a king than a peasant ever could. It was the jester, often employed by nobility, who could speak uncomfortable truths through humor without immediate repercussion, though the risk of offending the wrong person could be deadly. The spinners were another group whose contributions were vital to the medieval economy. Without spinners, there would be no cloth, and without cloth, there would be no trade, no clothing, no sails for ships, no armor for soldiers, and no blankets for the common folk. The job of the spinner required patience, skill, and perseverance. Many spinners worked long hours, often in poor light, twisting fibers of wool, flax, or hemp into thread. Their work was done primarily at home, where they were often surrounded by their children and families. While spinning was not as physically demanding as other labor, it was still a monotonous and tedious task. It was also often done in conjunction with other domestic duties, such as tending to the household, cooking, and caring for children. Women were typically the primary spinners, although in rural areas, men could sometimes be found doing the work as well. However, spinning could also become a form of creative expression. Some spinners, particularly those who worked in the weaving of tapestries or intricate cloth, became renowned artisans. These workers transformed simple fibers into items of beauty and necessity, demonstrating that even the most labor-intensive jobs could lead to artistic achievement. In the midst of all this labor, there was also the work of the almoner, the church official responsible for distributing charity to the poor. These individuals worked on behalf of the church, often providing alms to beggars, the sick, and those who could not care for themselves. While the almoner's work was grounded in charity and religious duty, it also placed them in close contact with society's most vulnerable individuals. They were tasked with the difficult job of balancing the needs of the poor with the resources available to the church. This often meant deciding who was worthy of charity and who wasn't, a position that required both compassion and a certain amount of detachment. The almoner often served as an intermediary between the suffering and the powers of the church, and while their position afforded them some authority, it was not a job without its own moral and ethical challenges. Each of these workers, whether buried deep in the muck of medieval society or struggling to survive in the margins of royal courts, played a part in the grand machine of the medieval world. Their labor, while often uncelebrated, was the very thing that allowed society to function, grow, and survive. Their names have been lost to history and their contributions forgotten, but they were, in many ways, the true architects of the Middle Ages. The chivalric knights and noble kings may have fought their battles, but it was these unsung laborers who kept the world from falling apart. Without them, medieval society would have been nothing but a fragile facade, crumbling under the weight of its own demands. As we dig further into the lives of these workers, we see that their stories told in the context of filth, disease, and danger are also stories of resilience, survival, and an indomitable spirit to endure. The medieval world may have been harsh, but it was also a world where every person, no matter how lowly their status, had a role to play in keeping the wheels of society turning. Their contributions may have been overlooked, but they were, without a doubt, the backbone of the medieval world. As we continue to delve deeper into the medieval world, we encounter more of these indispensable yet largely invisible workers. In an age where survival often depended on the ability to adapt and endure, there were certain professions that not only required grit and determination, but also a deep understanding of human nature and the world around them. These workers were the glue that held the vast and often chaotic medieval society together. Yet many of their roles were far from glamorous, as we begin to see in the cases of the watermen and ferrymen. The watermen, crucial for urban transportation and trade, were tasked with navigating the often treacherous waters of rivers, canals, and harbours. Cities like Venice, London, and Paris had vibrant waterway systems that allowed for the movement of goods and people, and it was these watermen who made it all possible. Whether ferrying passengers across a river or hauling goods from one port to another, these workers spent long hours on the water, battling both the elements and the dangers of their trade. The work was physically exhausting, requiring skill and knowledge of the currents, tides, and the layout of the waterway. The watermen also had to contend with poor weather conditions. Rain, snow, and harsh winds were common, and the waterways themselves were often filled with debris and obstructions. In cities like London, where the River Thames was a vital artery for trade and transport, watermen were constantly moving between piers, and their work was relentless. Many of these workers were docked in unsanitary areas of the city, surrounded by the smell of fish, salt, and the ever-present risk of falling into the polluted waters they navigated. Yet, despite the dangers and hardships of their labor, watermen were often considered part of the backbone of the urban economy. They facilitated trade, allowed cities to expand, and contributed to the very lifeblood of these thriving urban centers. But like many other laborers of the medieval period, they were rarely celebrated for their contributions. Their work, though vital, remained largely invisible to the elite who lived above the hustle and bustle of the waterways. The ferryman had a similar, if slightly more localized, role in medieval society. In smaller towns or along rivers where bridges were few and far between, ferrymen played a crucial part in connecting people to the outside world. These workers were often employed by the local lord or town, responsible for ensuring safe passage for travelers, merchants, and even soldiers across bodies of water. Like watermen, they had to navigate the dangers of unpredictable currents and weather conditions, often relying on nothing more than a small boat and a pole to ferry their passengers across. However, the work of a ferryman was not always as simple as it might seem. In many cases, they had to deal with the constant threat of robbers who took advantage of the isolation of riverbanks. Ferrymen were vulnerable to attack, as they often carried valuables with them, such as gold, silver, or the possessions of travelers. In some instances, ferrymen even found themselves embroiled in battles over the control of waterways. Their position, while humble, was one of critical importance to the flow of goods and people. Yet like many medieval workers, they were often forgotten in the annals of history. In towns and cities, workers like barrowmen, who transported heavy goods from place to place using simple carts and wheelbarrows, also faced harsh working conditions. These laborers were essential in moving food, materials, and tools through the narrow, cobbled streets of medieval cities. Often, they worked from dawn until dusk, hauling incredibly heavy loads through crowded, filthy streets. The heavy lifting and constant physical strain were enough to wear out even the strongest individuals, and yet these workers often faced little to no recognition for their backbreaking work. As we move from the more familiar laborers to those who worked in the darker corners of society, we encounter the public executioners, a group of workers whose job was as fraught with danger as it was with social stigma. Executioners were seen as necessary for maintaining law and order in a society where public executions were used as a form of both punishment and deterrence. The work itself was horrendous, requiring executioners to carry out sometimes gruesome executions in front of large crowds. Executioners were expected to be skilled with their instruments, whether it was the axe, sword, or halberd, to ensure a swift and clean execution. But the emotional toll of this job was heavy. The executioner had to live with the knowledge that each life they took left a permanent mark on their conscience. Even worse, executioners were often shunned by society. Despite the fact that they were performing the king's justice, they were considered unclean and dangerous. Many were ostracized, forbidden from entering churches, and were even banned from associating with the respectable classes. Their labor, although essential for maintaining order, left them with a stain on their social standing that few could ever escape. While executioners were seen as outcasts, there were others whose roles put them in direct opposition to the prevailing order. Heretics, those who defied the religious or political laws of the time, were often hunted down and persecuted. But even their persecutors had their own jobs to do. The inquisitors, working for the church, were tasked with identifying and prosecuting heretics, witches, and those who had broken the religious laws of the time. The role of an inquisitor was equally feared and revered. These individuals were often given broad powers to interrogate, torture, and punish those suspected of heresy, and their work was often done in secrecy. The psychological and moral burden of these jobs was immense, as inquisitors had to justify their actions to themselves, believing they were doing the Lord's work. Yet their power came at the cost of their own humanity. Many inquisitors became infamous for their cruelty, and their work, though seemingly done for the greater good, often resulted in the death and destruction of countless innocent lives. The butchers, too, played a significant role in medieval society. Though their work may seem less sinister than that of inquisitors or executioners, the act of slaughtering animals for food was often gruesome and dangerous. Butchers were responsible for slaughtering cattle, pigs, and sheep, breaking them down into cuts of meat for sale at the market. Butcher shops were often placed in the midst of cities, where the constant noise of chopping and the bloodstains on the floor were visible, reminders of the brutality of life in the medieval world. In addition to the obvious dangers of working with knives and axes, butchers faced the constant risk of disease and infection, as working with raw meat brought them into close contact with dangerous pathogens. Butchers were often respected for their skill, but they were also stigmatized for their role in the killing of animals. Some were even considered to be morally tainted due to the nature of their work, which involved the killing of living creatures for profit. Despite this, butchers were vital to the survival of the population, providing a key food source that helped sustain medieval communities. Without their work, many towns and villages would have faced starvation, yet they too often faced social ostracism, pushed into the shadows of society because of their work. Perhaps the most sobering profession of all was that of the grave robbers. In an age when medical knowledge was limited and dissection of the human body was a taboo, medical students and physicians often relied on illegally obtained bodies for their studies. Grave robbers would target recently buried corpses, digging them up in the dead of night and selling them to doctors and universities for the purpose of anatomical study. The work was dangerous, and grave robbers had to be careful to avoid detection, as stealing a body was punishable by death. But despite the risks, the grave robbers were critical to advancing the field of medicine. Their illegal activities helped provide the cadavers needed for doctors to gain a better understanding of the human body, eventually leading to advancements in anatomy and surgery. Yet, despite the importance of their work, grave robbers were universally reviled. They were seen as desecrators of the dead, violating the sanctity of burial grounds for financial gain. They lived on the fringes of society, constantly moving to avoid detection, and their work was considered morally reprehensible by the general population. Despite their efforts to provide bodies for scientific advancement, they were viewed as criminals operating in the shadows of a world that had little respect for their labor. And so, as we continue to peel back the layers of medieval society, we come to understand the vast network of workers whose labor was essential for the functioning of the world in which they lived. Their roles were often dangerous, degrading, and misunderstood, but they were also indispensable. From the gravediggers to the executioners, from the watermen to the grave robbers, each of these workers played a critical part in the vast, intricate machine of medieval life. Their contributions, often overlooked and uncelebrated, were the foundation upon which the medieval world stood quietly and relentlessly moving forward, one grueling job at a time. As we continue to explore the intricacies of medieval labor, we come to realize that the Middle Ages were a time of profound contrast and era that simultaneously celebrated grand achievements in architecture, art, and philosophy, while enduring the brutal realities of survival. Within this framework of harshness and necessity, we can see that nearly every aspect of life was shaped by workers whose labor was essential but too often invisible. These unsung heroes endured incredible hardship, and as we've seen, many of their jobs were fraught with physical danger, social stigma, and moral compromise. In the midst of this, the medieval herbalists and physicians, although often seen in a more favorable light, still faced their own sets of challenges. The practice of medicine was rudimentary at best, with a heavy reliance on herbal remedies, bloodletting, and trial-and-error procedures. Herbalists, who were often women, would gather plants from the wild, learning through trial and tradition what could alleviate ailments and what might prove fatal. They served as the medical backbone of rural communities, where formal medical treatment was either inaccessible or non-existent. These herbalists would brew potions, concoct salves, and administer advice on everything from fertility to the common cold. In many cases, they were also called upon to help with childbirth, a task fraught with danger. However, herbalists, particularly women, were often at risk of being branded as witches. If a woman's remedies were too successful, or if she was too knowledgeable in the eyes of the church, she might find herself accused of sorcery and condemned to the flames. Physicians of the medieval period, on the other hand, were often university trained, their knowledge limited to ancient texts by Greek and Roman scholars. While many worked in the courts of the wealthy and noble, others, especially in rural areas, were simply healers who had learned through experience or apprenticeship. Despite the seeming prestige of their work, medieval physicians were limited by their lack of real understanding of human anatomy. They had little understanding of diseases and their transmission, and often, their remedies did more harm than good. Physicians were often guilty of bleeding patients to cure ailments, administering toxic potions, or simply offering vague advice, which could do little to remedy the real causes of disease. Nevertheless, they were revered for their status and were frequently sought out by the wealthier classes who could afford their services. This disconnect between knowledge and practice in medicine during the Middle Ages was just one example of how even the most well-regarded professions could be precarious and unreliable. The medieval world, with all its intricacies and hardships, was built on the labor of countless individuals who worked without recognition, often in dangerous, dismal conditions, in service to an ungrateful society. For many of these workers, life was one of endurance, survival, and unseen contribution. Even more central to the maintenance of order in the medieval world were those who worked in areas that we might now consider morally or socially questionable. Take, for example, the moneylenders. In the eyes of the church, charging interest on loans was seen as usury and a sin. Yet moneylenders performed an indispensable service in the medieval economy. They provided loans to merchants, nobles, and even kings, facilitating trade and commerce across Europe. Without them, much of the medieval economy would have collapsed. But despite their importance, Moneylenders were often viewed with disdain by the general public, many of whom associated them with greed, corruption, and manipulation. The work of moneylenders was, at best, tolerated as a necessary evil, but they were rarely respected. Even worse, the profession was often dominated by Jewish communities, leading to anti-Semitic sentiments that resulted in persecution, forced expulsions, and the scapegoating of entire communities. In a time when credit was a rare and powerful commodity, those who provided it faced not only the dangers of financial ruin, but also intense social and religious hostility. Equally vilified, yet undeniably important, were the toll collectors who operated on the borders of towns and cities. These individuals were responsible for collecting taxes on goods and people moving through a city's gates. While these tolls were essential for funding the maintenance of roads, bridges, and city defenses, toll collectors were often despised by the very people they served. They were seen as extortionists, living off the hard-earned wages of merchants and travelers. While some toll collectors were simply doing their jobs, others would take advantage of their position, demanding excessive fees or even inventing false tolls. These abuses made toll collectors one of the most hated professions in medieval society. Their role, however, was undeniably vital to the functioning of medieval trade routes and cities, ensuring that the wealth of commerce could be channeled into the maintenance of public infrastructure. As we examine these various roles, from the humble and grueling labor of the field workers to the morally complex jobs of the moneylenders and toll collectors, we come to a clearer understanding of the hierarchical and often brutal world in which they worked. The social divide between the elites and the laborers was vast, and the labor of the common people, whether it was digging a well, transporting goods, cleaning streets, or teaching children, was almost always thankless and often invisible. Yet these workers were the engine that powered medieval society. Without them, the castles and cathedrals, the great trade routes, and the medieval cities would not have existed. The medieval laborer's life was defined by the constant interplay of necessity, survival, and sacrifice. These workers were the very backbone of medieval life. They built the infrastructure, maintained the health of the population, and ensured that trade, commerce, and society continued to function. Despite the often repulsive nature of their work and the immense challenges they faced, these individuals did not receive the recognition or rewards that would befit such crucial labor. Their hard work was buried under the grand achievements of the nobility and royalty, but without it, the so-called glory of the Middle Ages would have crumbled. The Middle Ages, a time both dark and dynamic, was shaped by these everyday workers, those who lived in the shadow of kings and queens, whose names never made it into history books, but whose contributions were woven into the very fabric of the medieval world. The laborers whose stories we have explored here formed the backbone of a society that was constantly on the edge of collapse, yet somehow they managed to survive, adapt, and keep the wheels of civilization turning. Though we often remember knights, kings, and noble heroes, it is the laborers, the gong farmers, the tanners, the grave diggers, and the toll collectors who truly made life possible in the Middle Ages. They were the unsung heroes, those who bore the weight of the world on their shoulders, day in and day out, with nothing more than the desire to survive, to provide, and to continue the daily grind of medieval life.